When film began to become accessible to wider demographics and, as a result, became more commonplace in the early 1900s, it was viewed as cheap entertainment by wealthy Americans who looked down on the way the medium simply captured a spectacle due to its focus on the movement of images rather than a structured narrative. This early cinema of attraction and actuality films, the latter of which focused on recording bits of everyday life, soon shifted to allow the possibility of further narrative through early sci-fi and horror films such as The Trip to the Moon and The Devil's Castle. The success of the Lumiere brothers' more versatile version of Edison's kinetoscope,
The cinematograph, which means writing with movement,
which could record, develop, and project moving pictures, further pushed the bounds of what depths could be reached through film. Though the budding film industry would struggle to find footing in the aftermath of two world wars with the Great Depression conveniently placed between them, it finally began coming into its own in a post-war world as a result of the heavy use of film-based propaganda during wartime.
Under the 8th Air Force are the 8th Bomber Command, the 8th Fighter Command, and the 8th Air Service Command.
As the film scene developed and the relationship between it and pop culture deepened, the term blockbuster began to be seen in publishing, cementing their ties. Films seem to reflect societal expectations, but are also influenced directly by modern-day ideas of morality, such as in the Hays Code, a set of self-imposed morality guidelines for movies produced from the years of 1934 to 1968.
the Hays Code, a catalog of things filmmakers could and couldn't show on screen. Fun.
The debate of whether art influences life or life influences art is paralleled in the world of film as to whether or not film parallels societal ideals or vice versa. This intimate relationship between society and the silver screen is part of what makes film such a versatile medium. The technical abilities which make film a fantastic mode for telling stories are often praised. It is multisensorial, being both visually and auditorily engaging, which allows it to enrapture wide audiences in a way that other mediums are unable to. But outside of its technical abilities, film itself as a medium has an equally enrapturing role in society, holding a unique mirror to reality. I would argue that no genre of film is able to hold this mirror up to society as definitively as horror. Horror taps into a deeply primal emotion, fear, and in doing so unintentionally shines a pure light on a wide variety of social expectations and constructions. Most predominantly, they can show what a society fears at the time of its production. One of the most famously discussed examples of this is the way late 70s and early 80s slasher films such as Friday the 13th and Halloween focused on the slashing of young promiscuous teenagers while leaving the only virgin alive in the infamous Final Girl. Horror is also particularly interesting to analyze because it heavily relies on tropes and conventions such as this. Every genre has tropes. Action has their background explosions, drama have their rainy scenes, and romances is actually just tropes. But horror is particularly rife with these common characters and narrative beats. The cabin, the mirror jump scare, Final Girl, the running into a corner and needlessly splitting up.
Again, I know this is gonna sound like something straight out of a horror movie, but I think we should split up into pairs.
Hell
no.
Are you kidding me? That sounds like something straight out of a horror movie.
Horror also has a particular emphasis on tropes as character roles. The Final Girl, the hero, the slasher, the minion, and so on. Just as the monsters and killers in horror movies can reflect the fears a society holds at the time a movie is created, the way that characters who hold certain roles in film are depicted can also reflect the way those within the real world who hold the same roles are viewed. The camera is often discussed as a voyeuristic extension of the gaze of the director, but it also acts as an extension of societal eyes. While many of these tropes and roles have been discussed ad nauseum, young girls in the Final Girl trope, and young maturing teenagers in iconic slasher films, one role I haven't seen discussed much, despite their common occurrence in a wide variety of horror films, is the role of mothers in horror films. Note, there will be spoilers for specific movies in this video, but I will be giving a warning and timestamps so those portions can be skipped. The world of film theory is highly, theoretical. One of the most famous film theories, Barbara Creed's The Monstrous Feminine, focuses on how women intersect with horror by deconstructing the roles women take as villainous creatures in horror. The 1993 book examines the ways in which horror antagonists, or antagonistic forces in horror, can be viewed as metaphors for women, mothers, and the feminine, suggesting that horror movies utilize images of exaggerated or grotesque femininity to evoke a sense of disgust within their viewers. Ultimately, she proposes 7 main forms of monstrous femininity. These are the archaic mother, possessed monster, monstrous womb, vampire, witch, femme castrice, and the castrating mother. Out of these 7 roles, only 3 are strictly associated with motherhood. The first is the archaic mother, who Creed defines as the parthenogenic mother, the mother as primordial abyss, the point of origin and of end. This archetype focuses highly on primality and reproduction. Think characters like the xenomorph mama in Alien. The second is the monstrous womb, which focuses even more intensely on reproduction, but particularly on anatomical features traditionally associated with female reproduction, such as eggs and the womb. A recent example of this in film is Immaculate. And the third is the castrating mother. How fun. The role of the castrating mother is likely the most famous archetype proposed within the monstrous feminine, and focuses on motherly monsters who are framed within the film as subtextually stripping men of traditional concepts of masculinity, which often results in the same man being portrayed after this as a monster within the film. It's interesting, and has a lot to do with constructions around gender identity within horror and film as a whole. In the style of Jenny Nicholson, we will be putting a pin in only this castrating mother role, because it is the only role proposed within the monstrous feminine that focuses on the role of a mother figure in the narrative, rather than something symbolically tied to a mother figure. This is also when I reveal my personal bias that I don't particularly love the monstrous feminine. The book is very interesting, and I would recommend it to anyone interested in the role of women in horror, but if I'm honest, it holds a little too much Freud for my taste, even as it attempts to dispute Freudian theories. The good news is that it doesn't really matter how I feel about the monstrous feminine, because it tends to focus more heavily on psychological phenomenon built on historical conceptions of women, and tends to get very theoretical, focusing on reproductive functions commonly associated with women, whereas I'm more interested in exploring modern social trends regarding the perception of maternal figures, and common tropes that we see in horror regarding characters who fulfill a motherly role. In the abundance of horror movies I have been exposed to, there are 4 key roles that I have seen mother characters in horror tend to fulfill. This is where I have to shout out the YouTube channel Dead Meat, who I have been watching for 7 years? Yeah, I already knew that because I had to write that into the script, but man, time flies. Here's me dressing up as Nancy Thompson for Halloween at 14 years old, and here's an old screenshot of the channel liking a tweet I made that same year. That was the best moment of my 14 years of life to that point, but what in the world was I doing on Twitter? Anyways, without Dead Meat, I would not have been exposed to horror on this level. In my personal exposure, I have observed the 4 main roles of the negligent nuclear, lesson learner, the monstrous matriarch, and the mama bear. I'm sorry, I tried really hard not to fall into alliteration, but it makes the names feel so much catchier and kitschy. In my analysis, I have focused on more recent horror movies, stretching from about the 70s to present day for 2 reasons. The first reason is that, in my opinion, this time period started the modern horror movement and popularization of horror. The prevalence of cinemas as a growing phenomenon pushed horror into a newfound cultural spotlight. See, my opening wasn't just a pretentious video essay introduction, it was foreshadowing. The second reason is ultimately horror has cycled through many different trends throughout time, but these trends really became more streamlined in the 70s with slashers. At this point, trends became much more focused, and while movies from the 70s are dated, I believe this is where we see the production quality reach a point largely similar to modern day films. It was also when we reached the point of having enough variety in content to see particular trends take place as a reflection of social changes and worldly events, rather than just being influenced by the fact they were produced by a small number of production studios. Anyways, most importantly, this is my video, and that's where I decided to focus. I associate this motherly trope most with the growth of American suburbia in the 70s. These are the moms in horror who throughout the film are just kind of there. Or, more horrifically, in the wake of a vast world of violence, they just aren't. These are the mother figures who coincidentally seem to be missing from the majority of the narrative, whether it be due to explained causes, passing away before the story takes place, or for no noted reason at all. These mothers can be the easiest to find, as they are generally written to give an excuse as to why a more stereotypical target in a horror film can become the victim, like young teenagers. This is the same reason why so many mothers in Disney princess movies are dead. It makes it easier for younger characters to have more agency than they would if they had a present parental figure. In the case of horror, though, this not only serves as a narrative function to award agency to young characters without having to do much complicated or time-consuming explaining in a film that already has a limited runtime, but also as a way to isolate them. It heightens the vulnerability of a teenager or a child character by stripping them of one of the defenses audiences would expect them to have. Narratively, this absence can also be used to add angst if the writers are feeling particularly nuanced, lending for a more three-dimensional shading to their characters. Most famous 70s or 80s horror films will have this trope. A Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, Scream, amongst countless others. This negligent mother is almost always accompanied by an equally negligent father figure, fulfilling the structure of a stereotypical nuclear family seen in many suburban slasher films, albeit a much more inattentive version of this structure. The other tropes that mothers fall into are more focused on the maternal rather than being seen in both parental figures, but this is the one trope that has a very prevalent male equivalent. I think this is due to the fact that the general reason this trope is utilized by filmmakers, to conveniently erase the restrictions parents pose to a younger character's agency or vulnerability in a film, is further benefited by it being applied to both of the parents. That being said, when the film focuses on erasing only one parent from the narrative, it is predominantly the mother, likely due to the societal expectation of mothers as a more direct caregiver to children within the nuclear family structure. Even by just erasing the mother from the narrative, it acts as a shorthand to the emotional effects of vulnerability and lack of guidance on the characters which a narrative centers. Even when the mother, or mother and father, has passed away, they still generally represent an ideal nuclear family structure which was once present. This trope is almost never really acknowledged in the media it is portrayed in. Not in some Joss Whedon, well that just happened, I can't believe Mom and Pa left us alone while a killer is on the loose kind of way, but there is rarely an explanation given. The parental presence is established early on in the film, and then when the third act showdown comes, they are nowhere to be found. Sometimes this is explained away with the parents on vacation, or is baked into the narrative structure, but this is much rarer and more recent following the meta-horror trend of the late 90s, before further solidifying as part of the even more recent hyper-focus on filling plot holes and not leaving room for YouTubers to point out the fact that there is a static clock prop in the background that was technically 3 seconds off from where it should be. One movie rife with missing matriarchs is none other than the 90s horror shining star, Scream, directed by Wes Craven. The film famously begins with Casey Beckett, played by Drew Barrymore, home alone when she receives a call. Parents nowhere to be found, she is tormented on the phone by an unseen assailant. Her parents only return home and enter the narrative once Casey and her boyfriend have already been killed. With the premature slaughtering of a character portrayed by a famous actor, something which would become ritual in sequential Scream movies, the narrative shifts to Sidney Prescott, who is just entirely on her own. In another case of a misplaced mother, Sidney's mother has become posthumous pre-narratively. Sidney's father, Neil, is also missing from the narrative, out on a business trip, leaving Sidney Prescott vulnerable to her own mobile abuse. As the movie progresses, Sidney remains without parent, and the only parental figure in Scream, Principal Himbry, is killed about halfway through the film. When the third act comes around, the setting has shifted to Schumacher's massive and massively isolated house, where he hosts a party for his fellow high schoolers. Once again, there are no mothers present or even mentioned. Time and time again, the maternal figures you would expect are not present in Scream. The film showcases the trope very well because within it, they kind of hit up all the types of absent mothers. Casey Beckett's mother is out with her father, Sidney Prescott's mother has passed away, and Stu Macher's mother is somewhere off screen. Is it Casey Becker? I think it's Casey Becker. This film at least explains the parents away and uses a thought of them throughout the film, but they are still non-existent throughout the narrative itself. This trope brings a certain subtle element of horror on its own. Of course, as I mentioned, it supports the narrative vulnerability of other characters, but it is, in and of itself, kind of horrifying. When analyzed more closely, which I am not saying you should do, I genuinely do believe they are generally written away for narrative convenience, these characters are markers of child neglect. Whether intentional or not, and whether realized or not, the absence of these characters is felt by the narrative. There is no older figure to call upon for protection. It is like a safety blanket is taken away from the victims being hunted down. The structures they are supposed to be able to rely on have failed them. They are alone, and they must face whatever terrors pursue them, alone. Thematically, it parallels the fears of growing up and realizing you no longer have the safety net that childhood provided you with. Or maybe the writers were just lazy, who knows. This trope also says a lot about the fear present in the nuclear family structure, that perhaps the societal ideal of a perfect nuclear family has a festering loneliness. At the time this trope began to pop up in horror, the suburbs were beginning to take shape and rapidly grow. As the 70s approached, the children born post-World War II were growing and beginning to push back against the glamorous suburban ideals of the 50s lifestyle. The 70s was an age of rock and roll, grown-out hair, protest. The trends of horror reflected this growing resistance. The absent nuclear family within horror, one that allows for such terror to take place, reveals a growing lack of faith in an idealized family structure, a trend which persists to this day. This trope reflects the negligent nuclear, but takes it a step further, and as a consequence, the mother becomes much more intertwined with the narrative. This is the mother or mother figure who makes a mistake early in the narrative, often by not believing something she should have, generally her child, and later faces the consequences of this error. In contrast to the negligent nuclear, the lesson learner is probably the least pervasive trope for mother characters. It can be seen in films like The Babadook, Child's Play 2019, specifically the 2019 one, and Megan. I will note that in Megan, it's not Katie, the main character's biological mother, who fulfills this role. Technically, as her mother dies in the opening scene, she's a negligent nuclear, but I will instead focus on her aunt who fills this trope. I counter due to the fact that she enters the role of a mother for Katie after her sister's death. With the lesson learner, we see a mother or someone fulfilling this role start the narrative by being absent in their child's life. For one reason or another, she is left alone with the child, be it through the death of her husband as seen in The Babadook and Child's Play 2019, or by other means. Technically, the mother could also still have a partner, and they could just be absent, but in all of the examples I mentioned, grief is a factor in the mother's neglect. The films show the mother is negligent in one form or another, overlooking things in their child's life.
It's not your birthday for a couple weeks, but this move has been really tough, and I know you're kind of mad at me.
I mean, if you're having Megan tuck Katie in and read her a bedtime story, then when are you ever spending time with her or even talking with her?
Then there is a clear warning sign, often from their own child. The mother sees this and the warning sign and either ignores it or reacts negatively to the child, further cementing the error that they have made.
I think Chucky did something to her.
Sweetie, Chucky is a toy.
As remarkable as she is, and she is remarkable, you could be building emotional connections with this doll that are too hard to untangle.
This also cements her fate. She must be punished by the narrative for her failures as a mother. Ultimately, her mistake results in both her and her child's lives being threatened. This is a direct result of her negligence and the warning signs that were missed by her. In the third act, when she finally is confronted with her shortcomings, she sees the ways that her mistakes have had unseen drastic consequences, and this forces her character to develop, leading her to finally fighting back, symbolically taking agency in her child's life once again, and narratively redeeming herself. The mother will fight back against the antagonist and defend her child, although in most films which have mothers fulfilling this role, the child themselves is the one to slay the foe they both face. I think it's Vanek. Vanek? I'm just gonna say that, and if I'm wrong, that sucks. The Babadook focuses on Amelia Vanek, a widowed mother of a 6-year-old named Sam. Sam begins to act strange and unusual, explaining that he is being tormented by a monster. One night when he cannot sleep, Amelia reads him a bedtime story from a book which he stumbles upon in their house. The story turns violent, speaking of a monster and violent acts which may occur. Sam believes the story to be true, but while Amelia is disturbed by the book, she ignores it and says it's not real, shredding the book and getting rid of it. This is the first warning sign she ignores. Throughout the film, strange things continue to happen and she begins to spiral. Amelia finds glass shards in her food, another vital warning sign, but she ignores it and instead gets angry at her son, assuming him to have put it in her soup. The book she ripped up reappears at her doorstep. She continually gets warning signs that her son is to be believed, but she ignores them, telling herself that the monster is not real. Finally, after so long of denying this creature's existence, she is possessed by the titular Babadook. Her son Sam is able to break her from the possession, and she fights back against this creature, saving her son from his grasps and finally stepping into the role she was neglecting in the wake of her husband's death. The Babadook serves as a direct metaphor for the grief Amelia faces, and the way that the more a feeling like grief is ignored and denied, the more monstrous and all-encompassing it becomes. The trope of the lesson learner itself instead comments on absent mothers, showing the importance of maternal guidance in a child's life. It reflects the consequences of neglecting a child and the ways that neglect can manifest. These negative effects only stop once the neglect has been acknowledged by the mother and a more active role is fulfilled, symbolically represented by the mother stepping into the third act fight and defending her child. This trope brings to light a lot of fears in society regarding single mothers. It shows the way that parentage of single mothers can be called into question, and I believe stems from a question of adequacy, whether or not single mothers can fulfill all aspects of their child's life, or if warning signs will be missed by them. I think it is particularly interesting because this is not a trope I've seen in horror frequently for men. There aren't often single fathers who endure this narrative arc. It is almost always mothers who have to undergo this process of failure and repentance within horror films. This reflects an emphasis put on mothers in society, where their failures are seen as infinitely more catastrophic than their male counterparts, due to the societal expectation for women to inherently be more involved in their children's lives. If a father watches his kids for the day, he is babysitting them. If a mother watches her kids for the day, she is being a mother. With these expectations, women are expected to take on more of the burden of children, and therefore her missteps are seen as far more disastrous due to her role being perceived as deeper and therefore more present for her children. I think this trope is seen more frequently for single mothers rather than single fathers because we expect this deep involvement from women. It becomes easier to exaggerate and turn into a horror story because it is easier for audiences to suspend their disbelief. Even when there is a single father, the emphasis still tends to be focused on the woman and her absence, rather than focusing on how the father functions in her absence. In Scream, for example, despite Sidney Prescott being the daughter of a deceased mother and a single father, the narrative focuses more on the absence of mother, rather than the role of her single father. Until, of course, the very end, when he is thrown back into the narrative to elevate the stakes by secretly being kidnapped the whole time.
Dad.
When a single mother is present in horror, it becomes a plot point. It is a vulnerability to be exploited to add to the horror of the film. When a single father is present, he is just a dad. When a single mother fails in horror, it becomes a failure, an error which necessitates punishment and correction. When a single father fails in horror, well, the narrative rarely even acknowledges it as a failure. Two of the most infamous mothers in horror are examples of the monstrous matriarch, the boy mom Pamela Voorhees and the xenomorph queen from Alien. Where the lesson learner fails to protect, the monstrous matriarch falls on the exact opposite side of the spectrum by seemingly overprotecting. She almost always will defend her babies at all cost, even her humanity, and ultimately, often her life. Yeah, guys, I know that the xenomorph isn't even a human, but that just made it more dramatic. This trope tends to focus on a defensive mama with a particular emphasis on themes of the maternal instinct to protect, but ultimately the role includes any mother turned monster. Another example of this in recent years, which does depart from the mom on the defense, is Annie Graham from Hereditary, who, on the opposite side of the spectrum, kind of internally destructs in the family. These mothers often get less screen time, but loom over the narrative. Throughout the story, there are whispers about them. The character is often fully revealed in the third act of the movie as the final showdown takes place. The true departure from the lesson learner trope, the thing that twists this maternal role from a defensive protagonist to a horrific antagonist, is that often the character is not simply defending, but often seeking revenge and is on the offense, such as in Scream 2, wherein Billy Loomis's mother attempts to avenge the murder of her murderous son. Sometimes in horror films, the mother figure will be inhabited by the antagonistic force temporarily, such as is seen in The Babadook, but it crosses the line into the monstrous matriarch when this character is framed by the narrative as the or a villain of the story. Ultimately, as these characters are antagonistic in the story, she will almost always be slain by the end of the movie so that the targets of her attacks can be free from her reign of terror. Within the monstrous matriarch role, there is a kind of subcategory of monstrous mothers who in turn create a monster. For convenience, we will call these the monster makers. In most of these cases, the mother themselves were violent and antagonists, which is why this role kind of acts as an offshoot of the monstrous matriarch, but this isn't always the case. Sometimes they are just framed as monstrous by the film for their actions, even if just judged by the narrative for parenting choices. The most prevalent character choice for these moms, and a trait in almost all monster-making mommies, is the way they coddle their child. In almost all examples of monster makers, their child is a son, and this coddling is almost always tied to the way that their sons become murderers. Her child usually outlasts her in the film, carrying on her legacy of violence. Sometimes they even outlast her in a sequel, like Jason Voorhees in Friday the 13th. When taking place in one film, the mother is generally killed by around the second act, and the third act begins with her child completing their transformation into violence. One key example of this trait in action is in the 2019 film Ready or Not, in which Alex Ladomas is portrayed as a protagonistic figure for most of the film, while his mother has to adopt the role of an antagonist. Oh, it feels weird to have it in this hand. This hand is like so cramped. Both this subtrope and the monstrous matriarch as a whole represents an overpossessive mother as dangerous, but the monster maker particularly emphasizes this, as not only is her own violence a manifestation of the negative consequences of such a thing, but it is further cemented in the next generation and the havoc which is passed down. Some films I would say contain these monster-making moms include Psycho, Ready or Not, Carrie, and Friday the 13th. As a film franchise, this is not present within just the first film alone. Now is also time to pull out the pin and talk about the ever so lovely castrating mother. The castrating mother is a similarly discussed topic in The Monstrous Feminine by Barbara Creed, although it brings into question some more technical feminist and Freudian theories. The name itself derives from a theory which the neurologist Sigmund Freud had pertaining to familial relations. He had clinical evidence that the mother may be seen as a castrator in a family structure, but personally believed it was the father instead who actually metaphorically enacted this. Creed proposes that often in horror, mother figures are presented as the castrators, metaphorically holding their children back from growing up in multiple ways. The mother is a watcher, an ever voyeuristic presence, and through these actions creates a monster. The proposal of this film theory is really interesting, but as I mentioned in the beginning, it is a lot more theoretical, diving into gender ideas such as the concept of mothers narratively stripping their sons of masculinity, whereas I am more interested in observing cultural cues within film rather than specific psychological observations. Creed's theory also focuses a lot on genitals and covert symbols for them within film, which isn't really where my social and archetypical approach lies. Friday the 13th cold opens with murders enacted by an unseen assailant in a flashback taking place in 1958 at Camp Crystal Lake. The film then jumps to modern day, in which Annie Phillips is heading to work at the camp, but then gets her first whispers of the antagonist when she is warned of the fact that this camp has a troubled history.
You're going to Camp Blood, ain't you? You'll never come back again. It's got a death curse.
Notably that a young boy drowned on its premises back in 1957. Annie then hitches a ride to camp, but is killed before she can make it by someone who the audience never sees. As the film progresses, the counselors at the camp are slowly killed off one by one until finally Alice is left alone. In her isolated state, she is met with the arrival of Mrs. Voorhees, a woman who claims to be a friend of the owner of the camp.
Well, I'm Mrs. Voorhees, an old friend of the Christies.
Surely this random woman appearing after a series of violent deaths is innocent, right? I mean, everybody knows that the killer in Friday the 13th is Jason, right?
Name the killer in Friday the 13th.
Jason! Jason! Jason!
I'm sorry. That's the wrong answer.
Oh. Mrs. Voorhees then reveals to Alice that she is the mother of the boy mentioned at the beginning of the film.
Jason was my son, and today is his birthday.
And that the death of her son Jason was caused by negligent counselors. In attempts to avenge her son's death, she has been killing counselors at Camp Crystal Lake. She then attempts to finish Alice off, kicking into action the final battle and the third act of the film. They run through the settings until they reach the beach, where they struggle with one another until Alice finishes off the mother by decapitating her. To show this trope take on the monster maker role, The film Ready or Not follows Grace, a young bride, as she marries into a wealthy family via Alex Ladomas. Unbeknownst to her, the family's wealth was built upon a deal made with the devil, referred to as Labal, decades upon decades ago. Per the requirements of the deal, whenever someone new marries into the family, they must draw a game card from a puzzle box. Usually this game is harmless, and all they must do is play the game to completion. When Grace draws a card for hide and seek, she learns the hard way that this is the one exception to that rule, as the family members begin to hunt her down to sacrifice her to Labal. To Labal? Throughout the movie, she runs, hides, and defends herself when she is able to, aided by her new husband who commits his love to her and desire to keep her from harm. As Grace's attempts at escape and survival are continuously thwarted and the situation becomes more and more dire, she becomes more desperate. At the end of the second act of the film, she is attacked by Becky, Alex's mother, and must kill her in defense. Alex walks in on this, and after a tense moment in which he realizes Grace will leave him after this is all said and done, his allegiances shift, and he switches to the family side, restraining Grace and calling for his family to come to sacrifice her. In this act of betrayal, directly triggered by his antagonistic mother's death, Alex Ladomas becomes an antagonist of the film and seals his ultimate narrative demise. Throughout the film, Alex had largely rejected his family, being estranged from them for years before marrying Grace, but as his mother states in her last interaction with him before her death, he is still a mama's boy at heart. He still relied on her for her approval in marriage, for funding the wedding, for familial approval, tricked Grace into a dishonest and dangerous marriage for the sake of his family, and when push came to shove, chose his estranged family over his new bride, directly triggered by the death of his mother. Despite his declarations of love to his wife, his attempts to save her from death and prove his good-natured heart, when his monstrous mommy died, he took her torch and carried her killer legacy on. These are mothers who are pushed to the edge, mothers whose love turns violent. This metaphorically can be taken in many directions, whether it be the way grief can drive one mad if it is left unchecked and uncared for, or the way anger can fester and become nasty. Overarchingly, this trope can represent a fear of the love of a mother becoming smothering, that too much love can turn violent and destructive, just like an absence of it can. Although I would say the negligent nuclear is the role that we see mothers fulfill in the highest number of horror films, I would argue that this is just due to the prevalence of films utilizing the absent mother trope to give their characters more agency. When mothers are an actual part of the narrative and are present as fully fledged characters rather than something necessitated by current human biology to exist, Mama Bear is generally the role we see them fill the most. This is the other side of the monstrous matriarch, which is on the other side of the lesson learner. This is the mama who defends her babies without missing warning signs or being framed as that antagonist by the narrative. There are many examples of this. A lot of films that start with The Shining, The Exorcist, The Ring, The Sixth Sense, even Stranger Things if you want to count that. This role is very similar to the lesson learner, but without as much vehement doubt on behalf of the mother, and therefore without as much punishment in the third act. The narrative also tends to present these mothers more sympathetically throughout the film, rather than just when she has a change of heart. This mother is often left alone, caring for her child as a single mother, whether by death of the father, such as in The Sixth Sense, separation from the father, as in The Ring, or the father being the antagonist, such as in The Shining. This mom will do whatever it takes to protect her child. This narrative arc generally begins with the mother being clued into a danger facing her child, with the danger slowly rising as they find a way to mitigate the issue. Eventually, this culminates in the feared danger becoming tangible and a more overt threat in the third act, and the mother fighting this antagonistic entity, although sometimes other forces will assist in the final takedown. At what point this arc takes place in the film depends on how big of a portion of the plot this story takes. In most films where this role is seen, it is the main plot, and therefore the arc begins very early on and is more drawn out. In certain films, such as in The Ring, this arc is brought in to create a more dramatic and heightened third act, and is therefore brought into being a bit later in the film. This motherly role is exemplified in The Shining, released in 1980 and famously, or infamously, directed by Stanley Kubrick. The film focuses on the Torrances, a family who will be staying at the Overlook Hotel in the Rocky Mountains over the winter time to care for and look after it. The film opens with Jack Torrance being briefed on his roles at the hotel and being warned of the violent fate of its previous caretaker.
I don't suppose they told you anything in Denver about the tragedy we had up here during the winter of 1970? Hired a man named Charles Grady as the winter caretaker. And he came up here with his wife and 2 little girls, I think about 8 and 10. At some point during the winter, he must have suffered some kind of a complete mental breakdown. He killed his family with an axe.
Back at home, his son has a seizure, and Wendy tells his doctor about an incident where Jack drunkenly dislocated Danny's shoulder, the first inkling of danger to come. Since that incident, Jack has been sober. The family moves into the hotel, and a month passes as Jack's mental state worsens. He neglects his writing and begins to have violent outbursts, berating Wendy when she checks in on him.
Whenever you come in here and interrupt me, you're breaking my concentration. You're distracting me, and it will then take me time to get back to where I was.
When a snowstorm comes, the Torrances are left with the radio as their only form of communication with the outside world. The days continue to pass, and Jack tells Wendy of a dream he had.
I dreamed that I killed you and Danny.
When Wendy later finds Danny with a bruise on his neck, Wendy immediately believes it to be caused by Jack, recognizing the warning signs. Jack has hallucinations? Or is actually talking to a ghost? It's up for interpretation. And Wendy tells him that Danny claims his bruises came from someone else in the hotel. Jack checks out the room Danny claims she was in, and despite seeing another ghost or hallucination, tells Wendy that nothing was there. Wendy says that she thinks it is time the family leaves the hotel, and Jack violently disagrees before descending into another hallucination. In this vision, he speaks with the previous caretaker of the hotel, who very specifically mentions the way his wife tried to protect their children from him, and, well, you know what happened.
I corrected them, sir. And when my wife tried to prevent me from doing my duty, I corrected her.
Jack reaches a breaking point and destroys the radio system while Wendy plots an escape for her and Danny, who is experiencing his own delusions. Throughout the third act, there is a lot of cat and mouse, and Wendy fights back against Jack as she and Danny evade him. Ultimately, they both make it out of the Overlook Hotel safely, leaving Jack to freeze. Due to her acknowledgement of the earlier warning signs, Wendy is able to spend a lot of this final act of the film fighting back against Jack and successfully escaping him. Although she is victimized by her husband, she never loses agency or is punished by the narrative. She's presented in a good light, protecting and sacrificing for her child's safety, and is ultimately rewarded by being able to save Danny and take him to safety. A lot of the horror of this trope is similar to The Lesson Learner, but pushed to an extreme. This role highlights the vulnerability of a single parent, particularly a mother in this case, not due to negligence or absence in her child's life, but due to the fact that she is alone. This is similar to the horror faced by the children of the negligent nuclear role, but with the added responsibility of having to take care of another life. Often these characters want to protect their child and would do anything to protect their child, but are not able to. There is a lack of agency that is particularly apparent in the Mama Bear role. The Mama Bear is alone, and because she is alone, she is vulnerable, and because she is vulnerable, she has a loss of agency, and at the end of the day, isn't a loss of agency the basis of horror and what makes the genre so frightening? The Mama Bear trope in horror similarly reflects fears in society with single mothers, but rather than highlighting a question of adequacy, it almost sympathizes with them. It points out the fact that they have been made vulnerable. These films often reaffirm the strength and determination of single mothers in society, focusing on a maternal instinct to protect and defend her children at all costs. It is interesting, though, because both Mama Bears and Monstrous matriarchs become violent within their films, but only the Mama Bear tends to be treated with sympathy by the narrative, while the Monstrous matriarch is not. The main difference between these characters' portrayals is that the Mama Bear is on the defensive, whereas the Monstrous matriarch is on the offensive. The Mama Bear has claimed to a certain level of vulnerability that the Monstrous matriarch doesn't, and therefore is kind of rewarded for her victimhood by being made into a protagonist of the film rather than an antagonist by the narrative. Beyond just roles, there also seems to be a scale that solo mothers in horror films fall on. The three roles that generally focus on solo mothers are the lesson learner, Monstrous matriarch, and Mama Bear. While the negligent nuclear can be a solo mom, I found this is generally uncommon, and when she is a solo mom, she tends to fall into the lesson learner category. Technically, any of the aforementioned categories could also be a mother who is not literally a single mother, but they are often left singled out by the narrative, as I previously mentioned. For your viewing delight, I have created a visual aid for this scale. For my own delight, I named it the Mother Goose scale. The scale goes from the mother having less agency to more agency. The first solo mama on the scale is the mama bear. These mothers want to protect their children, but for one reason or another, they aren't able to yet. This could be due to the fact that they literally are incapable of facing the antagonistic force, but most commonly is due to the fact that they simply don't fully know of the antagonist, or don't know how to confront it. In simple terms, these mothers have claws, but cannot use them until the third act of the film. In the middle of the scale is the lesson learner. These mothers don't want to protect their child from the antagonistic force. Not because they don't love their child or wouldn't protect their child, but due to the fact that they do not believe the antagonist is something that their child needs protection from. Often at the point of the film where they are made aware of the antagonist, they would be able to defeat the antagonist. This is either due to the fact that they have a level of power over the antagonist, or they have agency, but it is limited by their awareness. In simple terms, these mothers have claws and can use them, but don't. On the end of the scale is the monstrous matriarch. These mothers have the most agency. They know of a threat to their child, or what was once a threat to their child, and they are able to defend their child. In simple terms, these mothers have claws and can use them. With this scale, mothers fitting into each of these roles will spend most of the movie sitting on these spots on the scale, but generally only until the third act of the movie, and then comes the fun part. The third act is something I've mentioned a few times so far, and refers to the 3-act structure films tend to follow. All fictional narratives have certain beats they stereotypically hit. Musicals and most plays famously have 2 parts with an intermission in the middle. For films, it's generally this 3-act structure. The concept of the 3-act structure was popularized in 1979 by Sid Field and generally follows the structure of Act 1, the inciting incident, Act 2, the midpoint, and Act 3, the resolution, although initially it was more loosely described as simply a beginning, middle, and end. You can tell when you are in the third act of a movie because that is when the narrative generally begins to resolve. It is the beginning of the end. In horror movies, this third act usually begins with the final show-off with the antagonist. This would be when Pamela Voorhees is revealed to be Jason's mother in Friday the 13th, the beginning of the killing at Stu Macher's party and Scream, or in Halloween when Laurie goes to the Wallace house and finds the dead bodies. Going back to the scale, in the third act of the movie, it essentially flips. In the final act, the mama bear is able to finally fight the antagonist and defend her child. The lesson learner is kind of both able to fight and isn't. She generally is able to fight but loses the ability at some point, whether it be by possession or incapacitation, and then the child finishes the fight. And then the monstrous matriarch is stripped of her ability to fight, generally by death. Boom. Mama bear has claws and uses them, lesson learner has claws, can't exactly use them, but does anyways, and monstrous matriarch has claws and cannot use them. In some very theoretical way, it's not the mother having claws and causing violence that is condemned by the narrative. It is whether or not she was granted that by the narrative, or if she starts the movie that way, already able to do so. Although obviously there are more factors at play, such as being on the offensive versus defensive. If you do want to add negligent nuclears into the mix, the scale becomes more of a choose-your-own-adventure flowchart. And of course I made one. Have fun diagnosing your favorite horror moms. Most of the tropes I have mentioned that are used for mothers in horror films revolve around single motherhood, generally with the mother being alone through experiencing the loss of a husband or never marrying, but even when they have a husband in the film, he tends to be absent or antagonistic, like in The Shining. Most of the tropes I have mentioned that are used for mothers in horror films revolve around single motherhood, generally with the mother being alone through experiencing the loss of a husband or just never marrying. But even when they have a husband in the film, he tends to be absent or antagonistic, like in The Shining. Even when they are not an actual single mother, they are almost always a solo mom. Lesson learners like Amelia in the Babadook and the aunt of Katie and Megan are solo moms. Monstrous matriarchs like Pamela Voorhees and the Xenomorph Queen are solo moms. Mama bears like Wendy in The Shining and Chris in The Exorcist are solo moms. Horror is filled with single moms who must face, or become, the horror on their own. So, why? Well, remember why horror is so fascinating to study? All film has the intention of using the medium in a way that manipulates emotions through a multisensorial telling of stories. Horror as a genre is so unabashedly direct in this mission. The ultimate goal of horror is to elicit one specific emotion from viewers. It is so head-on and straight to the core of an emotion that is so primal, one of humans' base emotions for survival. In creating a horror film, one of the most crucial elements to eliciting that fear is finding something that can be exploited. One way of easily manipulating these emotions is by targeting a perceived vulnerability. It acts as a kind of shorthand. The harder an audience perceives it to be for a character to survive, the more dramatic it is of a journey to earn that survival. Women are a prime example of this in action, often being the ultimate target of horror films as a result of their perceived heightened state of vulnerability. Hence the emergence of the final girl trope, although the emergence of this trope in the 70s was more of a recognition of its existence. Women have been positioned as the ultimate target in horror films since the beginning of the genre with films like Dracula. This final girl trope is twofold. It both reflects a societal view of women as weaker and an easier target, and it reflects societal values placed on women to be pure and ever lovely. With this in mind, what other type of person is seen as hyper-vulnerable and is therefore often the ultimate target in horror films? Children. So a mom with her children hyper-vulnerable to the threat present in the film as a target or a key player in a horror film is almost like a simple math equation. You take a character who is already perceived as vulnerable and add another very vulnerable character into their care who they want to protect, and the stakes become even higher. You isolate that character, take away any support structure we're accustomed to seeing alongside them, like a husband, and the stakes of your horror film just became a lot higher. It isn't just a simple math equation, though. Solo moms are not just a woman plus a child. The mother-child relationship is also present to be exploited for further tension, a relationship that is seen in society as one of the most intimate and deepest bonds. There are also a lot of pre-existing social perceptions of mothers as being very protective. There's a reason the term mama bear existed before I decided to co-opt it. It may be for this reason that we don't see so many single dads in horror. The concept of a very protective and hands-on relationship between fathers and their children is not as pervasive in society, and men aren't seen anywhere near as vulnerable as women, even when they are also single parents. Just like with the final girl trope, this social relationship that single mothers in horror represent is a double-edged sword. While it is a reflection of a societal perception that forces solo mothers into the position of victims within films, reaffirming these social ideas by playing along with them, it also subverts them by the end of the film. Horror can be an intrinsically subversive genre in this way, as it generally relies upon the usage of characters perceived as being the most unlikely to survive, becoming the ultimate target of the film as a means of upping the tension. But, because survival to the end, and even often triumph over the antagonist, is generally required for a satisfying conclusion of a horror film to audiences, the unlikely ultimate target is usually the one to survive to the end and defeat the villain, even though the very reason they originally were focused on as a lead character of the film was the fact that the character is seen as unlikely to survive, or in a weakened state. This isn't all positive, though, because this reliance on exploiting single mothers within a horror narrative can still create a negative association with single mothers, as they can be viewed as kind of complicit in one form or another for allowing this horror to take place. This connection between single mothers and the violence which occurs can also show a certain level of dysfunction in single motherhood which is not present in single fathers in horror, heightened by the fact that they exist in a familial structure divorced from an immediate male presence. I think the most important takeaway, though, is that horror is ultimately not a monolith, so there is no one answer as to why a film may employ these solo mother tropes. Some horror films may be a product of the people helming their production, some a product of the time they were made in, and some just by coincidence. In some films, the subject can be handled very poorly, ultimately shining a negative light on single mothers, while other films may uplift and celebrate single mothers. There is no one answer why every single movie which follows a trope uses it, but the lack of a unifying reason to use a trope doesn't make the analysis, or even just observance, of tropes pointless. Bear with me because we are going to briefly dip into some etymology here. The word trope is often used similarly to cliché in the world of narrative stories. Even the Merriam-Webster dictionary immediately offers cliché as a synonym for trope, but the word actually originally referred to the use of figurative language in the world of literature. Similes, metaphors, allegories, all kinds of ways to refer to things in other words, to describe something or speak about it without speaking about it. The word trope was translated from the Greek word tropos, derived from the root of the verb trepin, which means to turn, to direct, to alter, to change. In the present day, especially in a world we're passionately hating on a subject, just wait until my next video, will get more views than praising it. Media tropes are easy targets to point out and criticize in the media that we consume. And honestly, a lot of the time it is justifiably so. Many times tropes do become crutches for writers, and though this is also oftentimes a result of screenwriters receiving less and less time on less and less pay to pump out more and more content, an over-reliance on tropes that are used in uninspired ways becomes boring for viewers. There is a hyper-focus in the modern day on how tropes are bad, but they aren't inherently so. Although the definition of tropes, when referring to media, has shifted from its original translation and use, it still functions the same way. These tropes still serve the function of figurative language, just a bit differently. Tropes can provide a comforting structure for viewers, but they can do so much more beyond that. Tropes serve as a point of mutual understanding between a creator and audiences, and can therefore serve as a good start for a story, like a shorthand for viewers. They can heighten emotions or exasperate a situation. The mother is alone and overworked. Audiences then understand that this character is in a vulnerable and precarious situation. The teenagers are adventurous. They are more likely to put themselves into a risky situation. Filmmakers do not have the time to explain every detail directly to an audience, so by using tropes, they can quickly communicate information that doesn't require more complex explanations in the narrative. Tropes can also reflect our world back at us. They tell us about, well, being human. Not only in the ways they can mirror the real world, acting as time capsules to the time period they were created in — many tropes outlive the era of cinema that founded them — but also in the fact that tropes exist because they work. Action has its background explosions because they make audiences feel cool. Dramas have their rainy scenes because they make audiences feel like a scene is more desperate. Tropes evoke feelings from the people that interact with them. The isolated cabin in the woods puts you on edge. The final girl makes you feel vulnerable and gives you someone to root for. The car not starting makes you feel stranded. These all exist because they strike a chord with viewers. They make them feel things. Tropes tell us what scares us, what makes us happy. It makes sense that horror, a genre so purely focused on accessing human emotions, would have an intricate relationship with tropes. You may not personally find the idea of having to share a bed unexpectedly with your travel companion romantic, or get a rush of adrenaline when you see someone walking away from an explosion, but some people do. Enough people do that storytellers and studios took note and catered to that human reaction. The tropes that exist because enough people react to them. Tropes are fascinating because they reflect our humanity back at us. There we go. Okay. Yay.